Hello. Passionate about sustainability, energy, and climate? You're in the right place. Welcome to Energ'Ethic. I'm Maureen Cornelis, and together we will engage with people who dedicate their lives to climate justice and making a just energy transition happen. They may be activists, scientists, policymakers, or other enthusiasts, just like you. Let their life stories and insights inspire you to build a better future for people and the planet.
Hi, I'm Maya Pereira, and I work at Europe's largest network of green NGOs, the European Environmental Bureau. The phrase just transition is everywhere in climate policy nowadays. But what does it really mean? Today, we're going beyond the buzzword to understand what makes a truly just transition. Renewable energy is quickly becoming the mainstream in Europe for electricity generation, and that's definitely news to celebrate. But the energy transition isn't just about dropping coal and switching to solar panels. It's about making sure that entire regions and workforces that have relied on fossil fuel industries for decades are uplifted and not abandoned as we decarbonise our economy. That's where the Just Transition Fund comes in. It's a nearly €20 billion pot of money set aside by the EU to help regions and workers affected by the decline of coal, oil, and other polluting industries. This all sounds great on paper, but we've got to make sure this money goes where it's needed the most. At the EUB, we've already been looking into this, and we found that renewable energy can be the key to uplifting these regions and creating high-quality jobs. For example, many of these fossil fuel regions already benefit from excellent electricity grid infrastructure, as well as plenty of degraded land available for siting solar and wind projects. Plus, they're already home to skilled workers who are used to handling large-scale industrial projects, ready to participate in a renewable transition with fair and equitable training, jobs, and wages. What we're talking about here is replacing 19th century industries that have polluted regional air and water for decades with clean, renewable powerhouses that benefit people and the planet. But this isn't just about creating jobs. It's about creating quality, sustainable jobs that ensure a fairer, more inclusive future for these regions. In today's episode, we'll explore success stories emerging from the Just Transition Fund and talk with Tuscany Bell from the European Public Service Union about how renewables can serve as a driver for just transition for both territories and workers. Let's get started.
Welcome to this new episode of Energ'Ethic. Let's meet Tuscany Bell, who leads the utility sector at EPSU, the European Federation of Public Service Unions, covering energy, waste, and water. She's also responsible for European Works Councils and company policy. In addition, Tuscany plays a key role in EPSU's climate and environmental policy. 5 years of experience at EPSU, Tuscany brings extensive knowledge of EU labour policy and industrial relations. And before joining EPSU, she worked in social services and communications, giving her a broad perspective on labour's rights. Tuscany holds an academic background in political sciences and law, and she's passionate about ensuring that public service remain at the heart of renewable energy transition. Join us as Tuscany shares her insight into the challenges and opportunities of aligning labor rights with climate action. Tuscany, welcome to Energ'Ethic.
Thank you.
So, Tuscany, what inspired you to get involved in the renewable energy transition and union work? It's not so usual, right?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, there was some luck definitely at play. So it was kind of chance when I first moved to Brussels, and then also just the development of interests over time. So I actually maybe wasn't clear, but my first role actually was in EPSU. So I worked first in comms in EPSU. That was my first job, my first kind of full-time job after my master's. So I had a couple of traineeships in communications. I'd focused in my master's, which was European politics, also very much on social policies. So then working in comms in the union movement was a natural fit. But I would say luck in the sense that I didn't really know much about unions before, especially not at European level. So it was kind of by chance that I ended up working in EPSU. But then, yeah, I loved it, basically. It was super, super interesting. It really combined so many different angles of things that I'm interested in. And so, yeah, I kind of looked to develop my career in the European labour movement. And then I worked in social services and youth. That was my second role in EPSU. And then I also started doing like a part-time master's in law at the same time, international law. And there I was very much focused on environment law, energy law, also a lot to do with like corporate governance and corporate accountability, due diligence and stuff like that. So then when the role that I now have became available, it kind of brought together everything that I was interested in. And yeah, it's been, as I was saying, like development of interest, but also I guess luck as well that I kind of managed to move into this really exciting sector, which brings together all of my interests.
That's really interesting what you just said about like kind of structuring your commitment and activism. Also because last episode of this series, the previous episode, we had it with Milka from Poland. And she said that she started working on really climate movements and just transition movements 25 years ago, when there was absolutely no curriculum about that. There was absolutely no interest about those kind of topics, and she had really to train herself. And you, on the other hand, you've been able to develop a proper curriculum career that really combines those two angles. And I find it quite fascinating because in a way, you are the embodiment that workers can actually train to those new topics, right? And they can get skills into many new topics, and that somehow the world is following. But is it following fast enough? Right. Can you tell us a little bit more about this kind of workers' perspective on really climate action?
It's hard. Is it following fast enough? It's a hard question. I mean, I guess the amount of like knowledge and opportunities to learn about these things probably is way more available now than it was. As you were saying, even the fact that, you can study specifically environment, like at international level, like environmental law, even that these things exist. And obviously following the Paris Agreement, there's lots more in that field. So I think the understanding that we need to develop these skills and knowledge is there, but there's still, I would say, especially in terms of the skills, like we don't know exactly what skills that we need to develop. And so there's like small kind of best practice examples of like different education being set up, but kind of on a global scale and on a European scale, the kind of skills that we need for the just transition is maybe not as known or understood as it should be.
And in your work in particular, so you work with the public service union, so I would expect them to be kind of big utilities, big incumbent suppliers, and somehow they have to deal with the changing world, with the decentralized renewables, with much bigger organizations. And somehow we are also calling at EU level and at international level for certain flexibility that is not really provided by big actors, but by smaller. So how do you bridge the gap, and how do you make sure the conversation still happens?
Well, we represent the public sector, but also the private sector. So anything that delivers a public service, basically. And as you said, in utilities, that's quite often delivered by private companies, especially in the energy sector. And I think the thing is that you need a really kind of coherent and comprehensive European approach. And that's really what we've seen. I know you've got this policy brief, which looks at the Just Transition Fund. So a bit of free advertising. It's a very good policy brief, and it kind of gives some examples of initiatives that have used the Just Transition Fund. But I think what the examples really show is that this can't be done on an individual initiative by initiative basis, because the scale of the transition that needs to happen is so big and is kind of so European, so global, in fact, that there needs to be a comprehensive approach that doesn't just kind of look at specific initiatives and doesn't just provide for specific initiatives. And another thing is the current mechanisms are very much focused on kind of carbon intensive and extractive industries, so they're limited to those. Whereas again, the whole world of work is going to have to change in response to climate change, and so it needs to be much more comprehensive and on a much bigger scale, I would say.
That's really interesting, because we just talked about like the curriculum and your own journey into climate and really workers' rights. But although it's something that seems very complicated to do with people who have years and years of work experience, and I mean, it's quite known that trade union members are usually a bit older. So what has been your experience really as Tuscany to notice this kind? Are you witnessing a clash of generation, right? what kind of trends are you seeing really on the ways really workers are facing and decided to really hold onto climate change issues?
I think, there's a few different things in what you said. So on the average age of the trade union members, of course, they're definitely aging, but so is the workforce in the energy sector. It's an aging workforce. And the problem there is that you lose a lot of skills. So as the older generation kind of retires and they're not instantly replaced with younger generation, those skills and that knowledge gets lost. So there's a big loss of knowledge and loss of skills. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with trying to make the energy sector more attractive to young people. And I think there's, really a lot of work to be done there. And in the sense of making these jobs attractive. And then that comes back into the work with the unions, is that the unionization rate is also declining especially amongst young people. So it's hard to work together to make these jobs attractive and then attract more young people into them. So definitely there kind of needs to be a intergenerational approach and working together. And that's actually one of the things that the unions are now trying to do. For example, so at European level, we have sectoral social dialogue committees. This is quite niche union stuff, but it's the union federations at European level. So it's EPSU and Industrial, which is another European Union federation. And then we work with Eurelectric, which is the employers association. So it's an association of electricity organizations, basically. And we have social dialogue at European level. And currently we're starting a new project. And one of the key kind of pillars of that project is looking at how to make these jobs attractive. So like to young people, how to kind of show that these are good quality jobs and which respect union rights. So it's very much about educating the younger generation about electricity jobs, but doing it with, a kind of trade union social dialogue approach.
That's really super interesting. And I would say that it's really about trying to make sure that the skills of today will match the skills of tomorrow, and really like the job market of today will match the one of tomorrow. And how do you have any kind of return on experience of, let's say, young people who would be interested in the energy sector, but do not really know how to start? And on the other hand, do they have do you know if they have some kind of preconceived ideas about the work sector in the energy sector?
So I think, especially kind of in oil and gas, I guess it's a perspective, but it's true. They're very male-dominated sectors. So maybe for kind of young women wanting to get involved in these sectors, it's that could be kind of not off-putting, but not seen as kind of the sector that you want to go in. And I think that goes back to like even younger, when kind of children are picking subjects at school. I think women are a lot less likely to go into the technical ones. But I would say in the more like emerging clean energy sectors, they are much more diverse. And the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, they do a lot of kind of research on this. So, it's global. It's not just European, but yeah, it really shows that the kind of emerging sectors are slightly better for gender diversity.
So what kind of good practice have you noticed working with the younger generation, older generation, really trying to make that shift happen?
I would say, at kind of company level, there are good practice examples, but I think what's really kind of where I see that this could be a better fit, where we can kind of get more young people involved in the energy sector, and at the same time we can kind of get the current workers in the energy sector engaged in more kind of youth activities, is really coming together with NGOs. So like the trade unions in the energy sector and the NGOs really working together, because I think we do have a similar goal. For example, we all want to just transition. From the union sector, this started very much as kind of looking at getting job-to-job transitions for the workers in, sectors that are going to be phased out. And then it's kind of grown into a wider movement. And you now have a lot of like NGOs looking at kind of the social aspects of the transition. And so I think there's, working together with NGOs and trade unions in this kind of field, it can bridge the gaps and bridge the generational divides. For example, I don't know, like EPSU works with the Right to Energy Coalition, and there we work with, very kind of, I would say, much more youthful organizations than sometimes we have in the trade unions.
That's really interesting because, it shows that unions and union jobs or union workers are also trying to really adapt to the changing world and changing dimensions and priorities. And that's good because, we really need we really need unions to defend our rights as workers and somehow also be at the forefront of many difficult issues, because otherwise it looks pretty clear like it's that we shouldn't be replicating the same kind of inequalities that we have seen and the kind of exploitation that comes from fossil fuel, etc. And so it really raises the big question about the pace of the transition as well. Like for instance, do we really want only solar panels on their roofs, even if they are produced in China in terrible conditions? It really raises all these kind of questions, and it's good that unions are here to embrace those questions and try to challenge the status quo somehow and be involved in kind of competitiveness discussion. We are recording this episode in early September 2024, and earlier this month was the Draghi report was published, and they said a lot about competition, but did they say much about workers' rights? Well, you tell me.
Yeah, I think the social element of the Draghi report is really missing a lot. And I think this whole idea about competitiveness and everything is what you really need to think is if we leave people behind, there's going to be no support for the transition. And that can be seen, I guess, like last year, I guess you're based in Brussels, but actually it was kind of European-wide. There were loads of farmers' protests and things like that. And the more that we have these kind of climate policies without social policies to match, the less we have support of the people and the less it's possible to kind of actually implement the transition. So I think it's in order to gain the necessary support, you really need to have both. You can't just kind of focus on the markets and the competitiveness or even just the climate. As much as we all, support the Paris objectives, if you just focus on the objectives with no kind of plan as to how that's going to work and how that's going to work for people, then no one's going to support it. So I think you always need to have these social elements in parallel.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier the fact that it was still difficult for the energy sector to attract women. As far as I know, women represent less than 25% of the workforce in the energy sector. What kind of job do you do really on the ground with the EPSU and the members of the EPSU to kind of promote women's participation and representativity as well in the movement?
I do think a lot of it's to do with kind of changing perceptions as to what the industries are, and especially in the energy sector, these are very, very kind of old sectors, and they were always male dominated. And so it kind of takes some time to overcome that inertia, so to speak. But we do a lot on kind of, well, first of all, in terms of like hiring practices and like transparency of hiring practices, selection criteria, things like that. There's also a lot to do with kind of work-life balance. Women are way more likely to have caring responsibilities, whether it's for children or elderly relatives. So a lot to do with kind of flexible working, things like that. Then there's also just to do with basically the facilities. Like, if you're working on a plant and they only have if they only have one toilet and the vast majority of workers are male, that's not a very comfortable environment for female workers. And, maybe it's just never been thought of because there were never enough women. But then at the same time, it's a kind of vicious cycle because you're not going to have more women. So there's really like a lot of things. And I think there's no kind of silver bullet to suddenly make it a more diverse sector, but it's looking at how to make the sector exciting, how to kind of show that there are, there are conditions that work for both men and women, even if they have caring responsibilities, which then in turn might encourage more men to take on caring responsibilities. So I think it's part of the whole like movement towards more gender equality in work. But then specifically with this, it's kind of making the conditions more attractive, I would say.
Absolutely. That's really interesting. And what you just mentioned about just having a proper restroom for women or having the changing room really for women is also those kind of little things that make a huge difference. And I remember a few years ago, I was in Mexico for a project, and I was talking to a female engineer who was saying that she and her colleague, they demanded to have changing rooms really dedicated for women because there had been cases of sexual harassment. And of course, it's not okay. And of course, it's not something that is tolerable in any environment, but in the work sector where it's actually the place where you are supposed to really earn a living and perhaps thrive also. That's like the basic worker protection and basic work condition that has to be defended. So also I look at the kind of work condition. It's also something that I've really never addressed in Energ'Ethic. So I'm really curious about this kind of topic. Is there any difference between the work conditions in fossil fuel industries compared to renewables and the kind of just transition? Is there at a certain moment a kind of, okay, let's ask the big questions. Let's see if we can start with a better blank page, or not a blank page, but a better page, and try to improve conditions at many different levels.
So I guess, the thing is oil and gas especially, they actually had quite good conditions. There was very high unionization rate. The pay was pretty good. Actually, in some of the jobs, it's kind of, the highest available in these technical kind of jobs. And yeah, normally they're standard contracts, so full-time contracts. So the conditions, I think, especially in oil and gas, were pretty good. And actually, the concern is more that in the kind of emerging technologies, the conditions are less good. One of the main challenges to overcome to ensure that the conditions are as good in emerging sectors, I guess, just for the simple fact that they are emerging and they're new and the workforce is new, the unionization rate is a lot lower, which means that there's a lot less kind of collective bargaining. And then, that kind of leads to also more precariousness in the contracts and, slightly less good conditions, actually. So it could be a clean slate, but unfortunately, well, at least up until now, it doesn't seem to be better. So that's one of the main challenges, to kind of ensure that it is better.
That's interesting. And is there any particular work that is done on your side or in your member side to really make sure that actually these improving conditions do happen?
Yeah, a big part of it is basic union work, I guess, organizing the workers. That's a big part of it. And that's not necessarily something that I do. That's more kind of would be done at the national level. And we have colleagues that are specifically there for organizing. And that's just trying to kind of increase the unionization rates. And then in terms of the conditions, obviously, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of negotiating, also European level, really lobbying for kind of more regulation on this. A big thing that that the European labour movement is asking for is a Just Transition Directive. So this is much more than the kind of just transition mechanism that's currently existing. And this would be a directive, much more comprehensive anyway. And I guess in that we would really have some provisions on the necessary kind of working conditions and collective bargaining and stuff like that. So.
Oh, that's really interesting. I had never heard about this Just Transition Directive. So please tell us more.
I can say many things about this. So the idea is that, as I said, that the just transition mechanism is not really fit for purpose. It's kind of much more focused on small initiatives. It's limited in its scope, so it's only limited to certain regions that are dependent on certain industries, and also just the funds available are nowhere near enough for the kind of scale of the transition. I think, the European Commission itself even estimated that 1.5 trillion euros is necessary for the just transition, or for the transition. So the funds are really not there currently. And then also in addition, it's kind of the just transition mechanism hasn't really been shown to work on the scale that's needed. For example, it didn't really include the unions in a lot of the plans. So there was a survey done by the European Trade Union Confederation and Industrial, that's another European Trade Union Federation. And I think it was 50% of unions hadn't been involved in these kind of plans to use the Just Transition Fund. And a lot of them also found that it was kind of like a box ticking exercise. So you get the money, but there's not really kind of a plan in place for the workers. And it's more just kind of, box ticking. And there was also, I guess, the council recommendation on just transition. But again, this is kind of soft law, it's non-binding. And it's really the review has shown that there's not really much in place because of this recommendation. So I guess from the union side, there's really a need for a kind of binding directive, which would not just cover certain industries or certain regions, but would be a kind of more comprehensive framework. And it would, mandate that unions should be involved in coming up with these plans, promote collective bargaining. Yes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what needs to happen for it to happen?
Well, a lot of, I guess, lobbying. I think, well, we'll see with the new commission. They've just come in. So I guess we don't know exactly yet what's foreseen. But I think when you look at what needs to be done, when actually you take kind of like a genuine look at what needs to be done and just like the scale and it's just huge. It's so big that you can't tackle it on kind of like you can't even tackle it on a national level. You really have to like have a very comprehensive approach. And so I think just kind of having very like realistic conversations as like, this is what we're faced with. This is the amount of money that's needed. That was even the European Commission estimate itself. It's like there needs to be a kind of, a policy framework in place that can kind of account for all of these things. Otherwise, people will be left behind. We won't have the necessary support. And I think it's important to take not just kind of a labour approach, but also to take the social aspects into account as well, like thinking about, energy poverty, all these things, and how communities are going to be affected, not just the workers. So a comprehensive approach, I think, so really kind of just speaking to the European Commission. I mean, and actually also the European Parliament has already supported this. So the European Parliament had a resolution in 2023 in November, I think it was, which basically called for a dedicated Just Transition Directive. And then the European Economic and Social Committee also supported this. It was the Belgian presidency, that was also 2023, that asked the European Economic and Social Committee to come up with a kind of opinion on this. And they also support the need for a Just Transition Directive. So I think the kind of arguments are there. It's just trying to kind of fight against all the people that are saying it's not necessary.
Yeah, I mean, it's about joining forces and beefing up to defend people's rights. And that's exactly what unions do. So that's it sounds already pretty much sound very much in the starting blocks to start this kind of conversation with the new commission that today it is not here with us yet. So we'll see. But I mean, that's really, really inspiring to see that, it's, of course, one step at a time, and, you need to learn from your mistakes and the mistakes that have been done at European level. And the fact that there is already a conversation about the just transition is good. I mean, it didn't exist 5 years ago. And, in the previous episode, so listeners, if you haven't listened to the previous episode, please do. It's part of the series supported by the EEB. Please really tune in, because that's also exactly what we said. So my guest was from Poland, and she was explaining the need for really tough conversations at the local level to make the just transition happen for the workers, to overcome energy poverty, and to have a way more comprehensive approach. And interestingly, she also said that many things have changed in the past 5 years. But as you say, if we want to go further, if we want to go faster, if we want to go better, we need more comprehensive instruments like a Just Transition Directive. I mean, that's a really, really interesting to hear, and really kind of practical, concrete feedback that I'm sure our listeners are craving for, and that's why they tune into Energ'Ethic. So that's really, really interesting. So there are some numbers about the budget that is needed, the pace that is needed, the age of the workers that are actually a little bit scary if you think about it, because it's like, okay, it's a little bit overwhelming because we are still aging continent, and we have those kind of needs and this kind of standard of living. So within this kind of directive, Just Transition Directive, what would be for you like let's say, the key priorities to see in it?
I think, a big one is, of course, the funding kind of, and this would obviously, a directive then has to be transposed at national level. So you can't kind of say this amount of funding has to be available or exactly how it's going to be made available, but there needs to be some kind of, plan as to how the necessary funds are going to be calculated and how they're going to be, made available. Not necessarily in a prescriptive way, but just as an understanding of this is what's needed. These are the funds that are needed. How are we going to do it? And then it's very much about kind of anticipating exactly what's going to happen. So which jobs are going to be kind of phased out, which jobs are going to have to change, because not all jobs are going to have to completely disappear. If you think about the gas sector, for example, whilst natural gas, is being phased out, then there's also hydrogen. So it's kind of understanding which jobs are going to be phased out, which jobs are going to have to change, and what are the skills and training needs for those jobs. Then plans in place for, I guess, things like gender equality. So how are we making sure that there's diversity and that women aren't kind of disproportionately affected or men disproportionately affected. So plans in place for that. And then plans to kind of how we can move a workforce from one sector to another without necessarily moving workers from one region to another. Because I think there's a lot of estimates as to how workers could be reskilled for new jobs, but that doesn't take into account the fact that they might have to move across the country. So kind of these sorts of things really need to be taken into account as well. And then, like the education that needs to be given in schools. And again, also things like health and safety, because some jobs aren't necessarily going to be phased out, but as climate change happens, as temperatures rise or temperatures fall as well in certain places, then the working conditions are going to change. That's going to become way more dangerous. So taking into account all these things, basically, having a very kind of comprehensive look at the world of work and thinking what's going to happen and how can we best prepare. And I mean, it's a huge task. When I say it all like that, you're like, oh, how is that possible? Absolutely. You have to start somewhere. So you have to start thinking about it. I mean, and the longer we don't think about it, the harder the task gets.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the displacement of workers. That's also part of the broader conversation about climate displacement. And it can be migration or displacement as refugees, of course, but it creates a lot of, it gets into another, let's say, level of policy, right? It's also something that we need to take into consideration, the fact that maybe we need to get more people from outside Europe to come work here to achieve our ambitions, while being sure that they also bring one day maybe their skills back to their country of origin. So it's really an important conversation that really transcends the borders of the EU and needs to happen at international level. So is it a conversation that happens at international level, I don't know, at COP or in this kind of platform? Because you mentioned several times the Paris Agreement, right? So is it like a kind of a lighthouse in the way you work as well?
To be honest, it's not so much a big topic, like as in the workers coming from outside the EU is not so much something that it's obviously mentioned, but it's not like it's something that we're working on massively, I wouldn't say. In terms of the kind of the global level, I mean, I would say the COP in general hasn't had nearly enough attention on the workforce, if any. So the first time that Just Transition was included in any of the documents was the last COP, and it was included, I think, in one of the working documents, or not in the official kind of declaration, but it was mentioned, and that was the first time. But the unions had been there for years, kind of saying Just Transition, and it was never mentioned until the very last COP. So in terms of the kind of preparedness for workforce moving, I wouldn't say that's nearly enough discussed or addressed at international level. I think there are some actually more and more discussions about kind of environmental refugees, which you mentioned a bit, but that's not so much to do with the workforce. That's more to do with people being displaced because, their homes are burning. So
yeah. That's interesting. And I mean, now you mentioned COP. I was in Dubai last year to present really something that I did on green skills in French-speaking countries. I did that for the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, and that was really interesting because, I mean, it was also with the Belgian presidency of the EU, so end of 2023. And we're kind of pushing for those kind of conversations to happen also at an international level, because there was also co-presidency, I think, of the International Renewable Energy Agency, Belgian presidency. So they were kind of trying to get at least some discussion about it, kind of influence about it, because we actually need a lot of data. And really one of the, let's say, biggest findings of this report that I conducted at the time was how big the mismatch was between the local needs and what is actually available. And most of the respondents came from African countries, where you still have like about half of the population don't have access to electricity, with, of course, huge regional disparities and local disparities. But I mean, the needs there for just transition is super pressing, and still the skills are not yet available. The businesses are not thriving the way they should. So it looks very promising if the EU is available to kind of set some benchmark of what a just transition should be and how and who it should involve, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's the lessons learned. Well, I think as you were saying, like this is kind of it's a global challenge that we face. And obviously I'm working in Europe, but the challenges can't be addressed alone. I mean, it doesn't matter if Europe reaches its Paris goals. If, other continents don't, then the world is still going to face the same problems. I mean, so we kind of do need to have this approach where we all need to succeed in the transition. And so sharing of best practices and working internationally for sure is very important. And we also have so EPSU is part of the Public Service International, which is the global federation of public service trade unions. And then you also have the International Confederation of Trade Unions. So there obviously is a link between what we do at European level and what happens at global level, and especially on issues like this, which are so global. Trying to kind of share best practices and work together as much as possible.
Yeah. So inspiring. Thank you so much, Tuscany. Do you have any additional comments you would like to make to our listeners today? Because it's been really super informative for me. And I would already like to thank you and the European Environmental Bureau for making this conversation possible. So let's tune in a couple of weeks for the next episode. It will be with Cosimo Tanzini from the European Environmental Bureau. This is a series on renewables' role in tackling energy poverty, in addressing climate change at different levels, different social dimensions, and really creating better jobs, better opportunities in EU's journey to climate neutrality.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was nice to speak about what we're doing in the unions, but I also learned a lot from you. So that was very nice. And I will also tune in for the next episode. So thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Energ'Ethic. It's been a pleasure diving deep into the world of sustainability and the just energy transition with some of the most forward-thinking mouths out there. I'm Maureen Cornelis, your host from policy consultancy Next Energy Consumer, and it's been an incredible journey growing this podcast together with you, our knowledgeable and passionate listeners. Since 2021, we've shared countless stories, insights, and ideas over more than 40 episodes, and it's all thanks to your support and enthusiasm. If you enjoyed our journey so far and want to help us keep the conversation going, why not support us on Patreon? Every bit helps us bring more inspiring content your way. Check out the show notes for the link. And hey, if you're a part of an organization that shares our passion for a sustainable and inclusive energy future, we're excited to explore sponsorship opportunities with you. It's a fantastic way to connect with a dedicated audience and make an even bigger impact together. Shout out to the fantastic Igor Mihailovich from Podcast Media Factory for his incredible sound design work, making every episode a joy to listen to. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Energ'Ethic on your favorite podcast platform. And if you think a friend or a colleague could benefit from our episode, we'd love for you to spread the word. It helps us grow and keep the energy transition conversation alive. Sharing is caring. Follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn to stay engaged and update on all things Energ'Ethic. Thanks once again for lending your ears. Until next time.